Welcome back to Politics Tonight, everyone. Thank you so much for staying with us. Now to our interview with the guest of the day. I'm joined by an economist, Emmanuel, for discussion on President Tinubu's first budget. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Emmanuel. Thank you. Mr. Emmanuel, the 2024 budget has been presented to the National Assembly. What do you consider the most instructive about it?
I didn't get that question. Can you say it one more time, please?
The 2024 budget has been presented to the National Assembly. What do you consider the most instructive about it?
Well, for me, I don't see the significant changes and improvements from the 2023 Appropriation Act. And the reason is because in 2023, debt servicing was 6.5 trillion naira, or 32.5% of the budget. In 2024, debt servicing has gone up to 8.2 trillion naira, which is 30% of the budget. Now, it is 30%, 2.5% lower. And you can see that revaluation loss on the exchange rate has pushed the debt servicing higher. The total debt now stands at 89 trillion, and it keeps going up because of the new debt that the government is acquiring. So, in my opinion, I think the most significant thing to note is the fact that the president is not really showing that he's pivoting away from that fiscal strategy of huge budget deficit, which is 48% in this 2024 budget, yes, and drawing down on the debt servicing and refinancing costs, which is very, very critical, because you basically need to borrow like 7.8 trillion naira to be able to fund 2024 budget. The question I have for the government is, how are they going to raise 7.8 trillion naira? Is it going to come from multilateral development banks? Is it going to come from the debt capital market through government bonds? Is it going to come from bilateral partners? Where is the money going to come from? And at what exchange interest rate is it going to come? If it's going to come from MDBs, you're going to look at anywhere between 1% and 5%. If you're getting money from bilateral partners, you can get from 1% to 30%. If you're getting money from the debt capital markets, you're looking at anywhere around 16 to 18%. To borrow money from MDBs and bilateral partners is very difficult. You can see that earlier this year, Nigerian government reached out to the Chinese Exim Bank through the Chinese government to borrow money to fund its fiscal strategy medium-term expenditure framework for 2017-2022, and it failed. So the question is, where does the government want to raise the money from?
But with a budget deficit of 9 trillion naira, can the budget bring the needed economic transformation?
Well, so I tell you what, the debt servicing to capital expenditure is 94.8%. Debt servicing to revenue is 45%, which means that you're going to be spending 94.8% of your capital expenditure, which is supposed to go into projects, that will readily push the needle forward into servicing debt. And then you have a situation where the government is struggling to raise revenue. The revenue to GDP ratio for tax is still anywhere around 11 to 12%. Non-revenue to GDP ratio is low because you have crude oil theft in the Niger Delta, and the government is struggling to raise its daily production output from 1.47 million barrels up to the OPEC quota that is given. It's benchmark that is going to be doing 1.78 million barrels per day. But the question is, how is the government planning to reach that target, since it's not been able to do that within the last several years, especially within the last 6 months? How does he expect to reach that target? So, for example, for me, I think the question is, what is the plan of the government, the Office of National Security Advisor that coordinates with all the security agencies, from Defense Intelligence to the DSS to the Marine Police to the Nigerian Navy to the Nigerian Army, to see that they can, work with NNPC and ensure that there is proper surveillance. They install pressure sensors on those pipes for detecting any change in motion for heat and pressure drop so that you can deploy security agencies to forestall vandalism and crude oil theft in the Niger Delta. That's the way for you to raise revenue. Because as it is right now, NNPC has commitments in forwards to international traders from direct sale, direct purchase that has not been fully paid off. So quite a number of the output you have that is produced daily outside of your JV cash call, your joint venture cash call between the owner of the block, the operator, and NNPC, which is a joint venture partner in that production sharing contract, already goes out to debts that it already owes. So how do you increase your output to a level where you can get significant dollar revenue to pay into FAC and meet up with the revenue shortfall and raise the revenue to GDP ratio for non-tax to revenue GDP ratio? That's a question we should be asking.
Right. But in the last 24 hours, there have been several reactions to this budget. I mean, the main opposition party, the PDP, says the proposed 27 trillion naira budget is designed to strangulate poor Nigerians. How will you react to that?
I try as much as possible not to get into politics, So I have the areas where I think there's been some improvements in the budget, and I have the areas where I think changes can be made. For example, if you look at the debt to GDP ratio, the interest on the debt is 3.88% for 2024, which is like lower than the 6.1% that you had in 2023. That's an improvement. The Fiscal Responsibility Act says that interest on GDP should not be more than 30%. So that is an improvement. Okay. The areas where I'm not comfortable with is the fact that the government is going to spend 30% of the budget to service debt and refinance existing debt, as against if you look at education and healthcare in that budget, the two of them cumulatively is 12.5%. Education and healthcare are the two most critical and important areas in any economy. 30% of the US budget, for example, goes to healthcare. Education and healthcare is absolutely critical. It shows you where a country is and where a country is going. The amount of money a government allocates to that. So if the government can move its fiscal strategy gradually away from debt, yes, to revenue, and reduce that deficit financing in the budget, it can allocate more money to education and healthcare. So you have, for example, the Abuja Declaration in 2010, where the Nigerian government had committed to giving 15% each to both UNESCO education and healthcare, WHO. These are commitments to United Nations, that 15% of Nigeria's budget will go to education, 15% of Nigeria's budget will go to healthcare, cumulatively 30%. So I try as much as possible not to get into the political squabbles between different political factions in Nigeria, because there are improvements in the budget, but there are also areas where I think they can significantly make changes to.
All right, that's fair enough. Let's also look at the revenue target of 18 trillion naira, which many have called quite ambitious. How feasible is this for the government?
Well, to be honest with you, I think it's feasible. And one very important area, apart from non-revenue, non-tax to GDP ratio that the government needs to pay attention to, is in the area, and this is an area where the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Reforms has actually highlighted. For example, Ogun State has about 44 state and local government taxes and levies on businesses. River State has about 91 state and local government taxes and levies on businesses. Nigeria needs to simplify its tax code, okay? There needs to be harmonization of the tax code across federating units. I liked when the chairman of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Reform said that Nigeria should not have more than 10 tax and levies across federating units. Telcos pay about 42 different taxes and levies across federating units. That is very high. So if you simplify the tax code and block revenue leakages, automate the tax process, you collapse the revenue collection functions of over 60 MDAs into the Federal Inland Revenue Service. There's no reason why, for example, the Nigerian Customs Service should be in charge of collecting tax revenue at the ports. It's not the work of the Nigerian Customs Service to collect revenue. It's the work of the Federal Inland Revenue Service. Everything should be centralized. So all these government MDAs coming together will block revenue leakages. It will reduce the ratio of tax collection to the tax collected. Yeah, it will improve the the amount of taxes that are generated, that tax to revenue, tax to GDP ratio can significantly go up to about 15 or 16% in 2024. And 18 trillion naira will be very realistic. Another area, for example, where the presidential committee needs to focus on, where the chairman of the Federal Inland Revenue needs to focus on, Mr. Zacchaeus, is in the area of under-assessment by tax authorities. They need to pay attention to under-assessment and ensure that the proper taxes are levied to companies across the country. If you block these leakages and loopholes, you see that 18% tax to GDP ratio is not impossible. It's very, very much achievable in 2024.
Right. So still talking about revenue generation, the country still depends heavily on oil for most of the revenue. Do you see oil providing the needed funds in the face of volatility in the market?
Well, so I don't think that even if the price of crude oil drops on the International Commodities Exchange in 2024, I don't think that the price will drop significantly below $70 or $68 per barrel. The government has benchmarked at $77 per barrel. So if, for example, the government, by very focused work and intensity, they're able to coordinate across board and reduce the amount of crude oil theft in Nigeria and raise the output to anywhere around 1.8 to 1.9 million barrels per day, definitely you will see that in the performance of the budget, right, the deficit financing that comes from debt will also reduce as more revenue will be generated to be able to fund the budget. I'll tell you categorically here, I don't think the Nigerian government can raise 7.8 trillion in debt to fund the 2024 budget. So the tax collection authorities, both for tax and non-tax, they need to, get on their game to see that the dividends that comes from, selling crude oil and paying into NNPC's account that CBN manages with the external asset managers, the Central Bank of Nigeria, which are 6 international banks, and the production petroleum product tax, PPT, that is collected by the Federal Inland Revenue Service actually improved. So for example, I think it's important for the CBN, the CBN governor gave a very rousing and very good speech at the bankers' dinner to pay attention to the foreign exchange policy and to pay attention to strategies to stabilize the exchange rate as a way to provide forward guidance for companies, especially institutional investors that want to bring in investments into oil and gas to improve the number of drilling rigs you have offshore. So you can stimulate because a lot of the international oil companies are moving away from onshore and shallow waters. They're moving offshore. They're selling those onshore assets to national oil companies, indigenous companies. They're moving offshore. But for them to move offshore, they need to build rigs. And it costs a lot of money. For you to incentivize them to come into Nigeria, you need a stable exchange rate. You need to work on inflation, and you need to work on the interest rates. And the thing is, if you work on the stability of the exchange rate market, it will affect inflation as inflation will begin to revise down because of the exposure of Nigeria's supply chain to the exchange rate. And as inflation begins to revise down, the CBN will be prompted to reduce interest rates and incentivize investors to come back into the market to make investments in the oil and gas sector that you need to actually increase the output for crude oil on a daily basis.
All right. So with security, job creation, education, and health being prioritized, how can these translate to economic growth for the country?
See, the calculation for your GDP growth rate, is basically from your metrics on consumer spending, improving the per capita income of Nigerians. It also has to do with your metrics on your inflation. It has to do with the stability of the exchange rates. It has to do with the output, production output in the economy. Look, I'll tell you, the president gave a speech, and he said in his projection that he expects that Nigeria is going to grow at 3.76%, which is actually higher than the global expected weighted average for GDP growth rate around the world. Nigeria currently is growing at 2.54%. I don't think that within the next 13 months, Nigeria will suddenly leap 1.2% in terms of GDP growth, because 2024 is going to be a year of rebalancing. That's what I call 2024. 2024 will be a year where the government will try to find its feet and will try to rebalance and see how the removal of petrol subsidy and the finding a true north, a curve for the stability of the exchange rate will impact on the economy. Also, I think that if Nigeria can, win itself off the dependence of import of petroleum products, and you can come back to that backward integration where commercial refineries in Nigeria start producing all these products and relieve the foreign exchange market for the demand that goes into importing PMS, AGO, and the likes of them, you'll see that the growth will be affected positively. If you can get that refinery in Lagos up to 50% capacity utilization, you'll see a 0.5% appreciation in GDP growth. So if, for example, that the refinery in Lagos, Dangote Refinery, has projected that they're going to get up to full capacity utilization by December of 2024, then we're looking at anywhere around 3.5% in terms of GDP growth rate for 2024. Because that refinery is critical and is very, very much at the center of 2024 actually, switching on. I call it switching on, rebalancing the economy and switching the economy back to the path of growth, because it's going to really impact on the supply chain for energy for the entire Nigerian economy. But in terms of 30.76% is optimistic. Is it possible that Nigeria achieves 30.76%? Is possible. But based on all the indicators I've looked at, I actually think that the GDP growth rate is going to fall a little below the president's estimate.
All right. But you would also agree that rising inflation and exchange rates will be big challenges for effective implementation of this budget. What do you think government can do to mitigate this?
So the inflation, exchange rates, and the interest rates, they work together. They work in tandem. That's why the number one job of every central bank is to maintain price stability. Because what you do with your exchange rate impacts on what happens to inflation. And what happens to inflation impacts on what happens to interest rates. Now, as I said earlier, Nigeria's supply chain is exposed heavily so if you look at the basket that is used in calculating inflation, for example, it's mostly energy and food. Think about wheat. Think about the fact that Nigeria imports 5 million metric tons of wheat. Think about the fact that from January 2022 up until now, the price of a loaf of bread went up from 350, 400 naira per loaf to 1,000 naira, 1,100 naira per loaf in most cities of Nigeria. Why? The cost of wheat. The cost of wheat, the shortage of wheat and the cost of wheat. As the exchange rate dropped and it costs more to import wheat, to import sugar, to import several other commodities that are used for production, starch, ethanol, several other commodities that are used for manufacturing, FMCG manufacturing, you started seeing the impact that had on inflation. Between 2022 January and December 2023, that starts tomorrow, or November 30th, 2023, inflation went up from 16.75% to 31.1% for food inflation, 27.3% for headline inflation. And you see that as inflation went up, between the same period, the central bank raised the interest rates from 11.5% to 18.75% where you currently have it. So as inflation goes up, because your supply chain is exposed to imports and your currency is dropping because the government went ahead with printing money through quantitative easing, taking money from banks to fund government expenditure, taking money from public sector MDAs to fund government expenditure at 0% interest. Yeah. you could see that because you didn't have external reserves and access to back that quantitative easing or printing of money,
All right.
the naira started falling significantly. So for you to stop it, number one, the president needs to rein in on the National Assembly to ensure that they provide oversight for the central bank. They stop ways and means and limit it to the level stated by the law, which is 15% of real revenues for the previous accounting year. So if, for example, the government goes ahead and it does 18 trillion naira in revenues in 2024, that law says that the limit on which the federal government can borrow from the Central Bank of Nigeria must not exceed 15% of 18 trillion naira in 2024. That plays an important factor in the strength of the naira, and the strength of the naira determines your inflation, and inflation determines your interest
All right,
rates.
then. Mr. Emmanuel, we're out of time. Sadly, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I've been speaking with an economist, Kelvin Emmanuel, as we discuss President Tinubu's first budget. Thank you so much for coming on Politics Tonight for this very important conversation. Thank you for joining us.